Now it's time to talk about the Moronidae, which are the true basses or the sea basses, the temperate basses. But these are not the black basses. So this is not largemouth bass, smallmouth bass. Those are in the Centrarchidae, which we'll talk about here in a second. They do look a lot alike, though. And so the first thing we have to do is figure out how we're going to tell these families apart. And in the Moronidae, the spinous and the soft dorsal fin are not connected. But in all the centrarchids, they are connected. Some of them, they're not broadly connected, but in the Moronidae, they are not connected. And so you can see a definite notch between the two. But you can also see that they have that fusiform or bass-like body form. And so they do look very similar. So we got 4 species in Kentucky plus 1 common hybrid. The yellow bass, the striped bass, the white perch, and then the hybrids we're going to talk about. White perch are pretty rare, but we're going to learn how to identify the rest of them. So now the hybrids are something that you have to learn to identify because you're going to run into them. They're quite common. They don't tend to occur naturally. I'm sure there are some areas where the hybrids form in nature, but most of the time you're going to run into hybrids because they're stocked. So culturists produce a lot of these. They get stocked into a lot of reservoirs. And, why do they produce the hybrid and not the pure species? You can get hybrid vigor, and so I think they do well. They're easier to culture. They probably do a little bit better in a wider variety of environments. I don't really have much to back this up, but it's just one of those things that there's a lot of culture and a lot of hybridization that's made by humans. And so in fish, when we write the hybrid, we include both specific epithets, and we always put the female first. And in some of the older literature, this is not true, but this is the convention now. And so you've got, for example, this hybrid would be M. sexatilis bichrysops. Excuse me. And so that is the female striper crossed with a male white bass. And this is probably the most common hybrid you're going to run into. And it's called a palmetto bass, but most people will call this a wiper. Get it? White striper. And the reason that this is common, there's a couple of reasons. One, the stripers get bigger. And so the striper female is much bigger than the white bass female. And since the size of the female is well correlated with the number of eggs, if you're producing these in a hatchery, you can get more eggs out of a striper female. So that's one reason. Another reason is that some of the early research that was done showed that this cross did very well, but then the reciprocal cross did not. And so people just stayed away from the reciprocal cross. And then it was only years later that someone kind of checked, and most of that early research was wrong. And the reciprocal does just as well. But I think probably because of the large females is why you still tend to see the wiper is more common. Now the reciprocal would be the male striper and the female white bass. And that's called the sunshine bass. Okay. And again, this goes back to, having these special names goes back to sort of what I talked about earlier, like when I was talking about trout, where you have a group of fish that is cultured quite a bit and is studied quite a bit. You tend to get like specialized names for certain things. And so that's where this came up with. Also, this is a lot of marketing. These are fish that are popular sport fish. They're stocked a lot. They're also really, really good in aquaculture. They are really, really tasty. And so the marketing also has something to do with the names. Okay. Stripers are anadromous. Your yellow bass, your white bass tend to be, they're freshwater fish. They're landlocked. But stripers grow in the ocean and then ascend streams to spawn. But they're different than trout and salmon. So they are the same in that they swim way upstream. And they need a very long stretch of open river. And so then they broadcast spawn. So whereas a salmon will go upstream and build a redd and spawn, and the eggs will stick right down and go into the gravel and stay there and develop inside the gravel, the striper eggs are very slightly negatively buoyant. So negatively buoyant means that they sink, but very slowly, right? If you have neutral buoyancy, you don't sink or you don't float. Positive buoyancy means you float. And so they very slowly sink. But since they're broadcast into a moving river, they just kind of bounce and roll and tumble along the bottom. And that's how they develop. So again, contrast that with a salmon, where the eggs go straight to the bottom, they get in between the gravel, and they stay there until they hatch. These need that flowing water. They need to keep bouncing along. And as they bounce along, the egg develops and develops and develops. And right when the eggs get to the mouth of the river, it's about time to hatch, and they hatch, and they're right there at the mouth of the river, and they can go out into the ocean. And so it works perfectly until we put a dam on the river. And so then when you put a dam on the river, the stripers can't go up as far as they want to. So they have to spawn just below that dam, and they don't have as long a stretch of open river. And so the eggs go and they tumble and they tumble, but when they reach the mouth of the river, they're not ready to hatch because the river is shorter than what it used to be. And since those eggs are negatively buoyant, they sink, but now you're not in a flowing current. Now you're in the river, you're in the ocean. So they just sink to the bottom, get covered in sediment, and so the dams really affect the spawning of the stripers. Now, the stripers don't have to grow in saltwater. They do just fine in freshwater. And there is one landlocked population of stripers in Virginia or West Virginia that actually they built a dam which trapped a bunch of stripers inside the reservoir, but they have a long enough headwater coming into that reservoir that they can actually spawn. I think it's the only landlocked population of stripers. And then if you stock stripers into freshwater, they do just fine. But if you talk about the natural, their natural spawning behavior on the coast, they would like to ascend these streams and spawn, but they just can't. So this is affecting their population. Okay, how are we going to ID these? We're not going to worry about the white perch. We're going to worry about the yellow bass, white bass, striper, and the hybrids. First thing we can use is tooth patch on the tongue. And this is on the back of the tongue. They all have a tooth patch or a couple of tooth patches, I guess, on the front of the tongue. I'm talking and the back of the tongue. Now, if it's absent, that's a yellow bass. They don't have one. The white has one big tooth patch, and the stripers and the hybrids have two tooth patches in the back of the tongue. So one way to remember this is yellow has a 0 in it, right? It's the only one with a O or a 0. And white has one syllable, whereas striper and hybrid have more than one syllable. So that's one way to remember who has the tooth patch and who doesn't have it. And so here's my crude drawing of this. And again, you see on the tip of the tongue, they all have tooth patches there. We're talking in the middle of the back of the tongue. And this is really more useful for adult fish because you have to be able to open up the mouth and really get a good look at the tongue. And so there's your one tooth patch. And the stripers and the hybrids, it's a definite groove. And so when you see it, there's no mistaking it. They definitely have a groove. There's definitely 2 rows of tooth patches. Here's a drawing. I believe this is from Fishes of Tennessee, showing the same thing. And what they're showing you here is that the striper and the hybrid both have 2 tooth patches, but you can see in the hybrid, they're closer together. So they're almost one, which makes sense, right? Because it's a little bit like a striper, it's a little bit like a white bass. And so it's got the 2 patches, but they're close together, almost forming one. So here's some pictures of fish that I've caught, and this is what one tooth patch looks like. You do not see a groove in that tooth patch in the back of the tongue. But in this fish, which looks like it probably was a hybrid, there you see a definite group, right? You can see something running between the teeth on there. So you can't miss it. And like I said, the yellow bass does not have it, and they're often small, and with yellow bass and with these other fish, it really only works when you've got a bigger fish that you can see the tongue on. So we have actually a couple other ways we can identify these fish. One that's real good is to look at the anal spines. And so you've got 3 anal spines in all these species. And the first one is always short in all of them. But it's the last 2. If the last 2 are the same length, those are the 2 L's in yellow. That's the yellow bass. But if you've got stair steps, if you've got short and then a medium and then a large, or if you've got the Goldilocks and the 3 bears, right? One's too short, one's too long, and one's just right. However you want to remember it. That's going to be your white or your striper or your hybrid. So this is really good for identifying the yellow bass. The 2 equal spines are the L's in yellow, which is what I'm saying here. And so here is a good picture of this. You see how that first one is always a runt. But here these 2 are exactly the same length. Whereas in this fish, you got the stair step. And so that'll help you identify the yellow bass, because like I said, they're smaller, you can't see their lack of tooth patch. And that's a problem with a negative characteristic. If a species does not have something, well, do they not have it, or do I just not see it? That's always a little bit of a difficulty. And the yellow bass are, guess what? Often yellow, and they've got a yellow cast to them. Now, the yellow bass, we can figure those out. Now we've got the whites, the stripers, and the hybrids. How are we going to tell them apart? Well, you can use the teeth patch, which kind of separates the white bass out. But if that's hard to see, or if you've got a smaller fish, you can look at the lateral stripes, and you can look at the body shape. So stripers are long and slender. They're much longer and more streamlined than the white bass, and of course the hybrid is sort of in between the 2. And so this is a Ryan with a good Cumberland Lake striper. Here's a striper I caught. You can see they're long and slender. And when they're a striper, think stripes. They have many stripes that go all the way to the tail. And so you can see that in this picture here. Whereas a white bass only has 1 stripe that goes to the tail. And the white bass is more deeper bodied. It's not long and slender. It's more not quite panfish-like, but you can see it's stockier. Excuse me. Now the hybrid is going to be in between these 2. And so it's a little bit more slender than the white bass, but not like a striped bass. It may have a couple of stripes going to the tail, but what you always see in the hybrid is the stripes are broken. And they're not going to be broken in a striper or a white bass. And so they drew the broken stripes up high on this fish. More often than not, I think the broken stripes are down low. And so here you see a hybrid fish that's got these broken stripes, and they're all messed up. And so, again, you kind of think, well, it's halfway between a striper, which got a lot of stripes, and a white, which doesn't have a lot of stripes, and so it's got kind of confused stripes. Now, the yellow bass also has broken stripes, but we already know how to, we can easily tell if you got a yellow bass. You don't even bother looking at the stripes. You look at the tongue, but you really look at those anal spines. But the the break in the stripes in the yellow is different. So look at this hybrid and then look at this yellow. The yellow broken stripes always look like this. It's always low in the body. It's always just a little shift. It's just like there was just like a fault line or something that just kind of shifted a little bit one time, but the stripes stay straight, whereas in that hybrid, they're all kind of cootered up. And so if you use all these, you should be able to identify these fish. And here I'm comparing the 3 of them. And again, look at that body shape, how that striper is long and slender, the white is stockier, the hybrid is kind of in between. You see that the striper's got a lot of stripes going to the tail, the white has one, the hybrid has a few, but then look at how they're broken. The top one and the bottom one, you don't have any broken stripes, but that middle one, you've got broken stripes. And here's a former student of mine, Narissa. She's holding a hybrid, it looks like. And then the person she's with, that is a white bass. And these came out of the Illinois River, and they think that was probably the world record white bass they shocked up and threw back. And here's a Illinois state record hybrid bass that we shocked up in my class. That's just a fatty. Just look at that. That's a beautiful fish. And yeah, we put her back too. Okay, so that's how you identify the Moronidae. That's all I got. I'll see you later.